Welcome back to the Comics Cube. Today we are drafting the top 10 Superman artists of all time. So what's going to happen is I'm going to pick who I think is the best Superman artist ever, and then LaMar is going to pick whoever's top on his list, who's not the one I just picked, and then Paul, and back to me until we get to 10, and those 10 will be the greatest Superman artists ever. Okay. If you've pre-prepared a list, and we name someone, I'm going to ask you who they were where they were on your list. Okay, so for me, the first pick is, and I think this might be a cheat for anyone who's DC related, because I really think this person defined the look of DC for the masses for a whole generation, maybe more than one generation, and that man and he actually did draw a bunch of Superman comics in the Bronze Age, and that man is Jose Luis Garcia-Lopez, the guy behind the DC model sheets and basically the guy that you see on all of your merchandise. Anyone else have him on listed anywhere?
I didn't have him in. My list isn't in order, but I had him on my list definitely, without a doubt. It's something like quite fluid and graceful about the way he draws Superman. I think that's been quite influential over the years. You know, a lot of the time when you see Superman artists, especially before the 70s, draw Superman, he's kind of almost spread-eagled and he's flying. But Jose Luis Garcia-Lopez is one of those people who draw him. It's almost like it's really graceful the way he's flying through the air. And then that's something that I don't know if he got it from Christopher Reeve or Christopher Reeve got it from artists like him, but that certainly became more apparent then after the Superman movies.
Yeah, there was, for me, a big thing is a lot of Superman looks before Christopher Reeve didn't really look like Christopher Reeve. You got a pretty high forehead, the cape isn't as long. And then after that, he became looking more like Christopher Reeve, and Garcia-Lopez was the guy who was pretty much drawing Superman that way like the whole time. LaMar, do you have him on your list? Yeah,
definitely. And for me, he's one of these rare artists that when they draw figures, like, because there's all sorts of devices in comics, visual devices that allow you to portray motion, and a cape is one of them, one of the early ones. But his characters, they have like this power even when they're not moving, and very few artists have been able to do that. Jack Kirby is one that I always think about. Like his characters just look like they're about to come off the page. But with JLGL, his characters, they look like they're in constant motion even when they're not moving. So you have that because of the grace with which he does his character work, and you see that too also like in people like Neil Adams and in a few other people, when they move, their clothing seems like it's moving. So it's not just like something that's just drawn on a character and it's stiff. So his characters have a lot of life to them. And when you have a character that's flying, like what Paulie said, it adds an extra like depth to like the actual presentation that you're looking at. And for a character like Superman that's dynamic in a lot of different ways because his powers are physical displays, it's important. And I, especially with him being the guy who basically did all of the promo stuff for DC and like especially like the Underoos, like when I was a little boy, it's kind of hard for you to think of Superman artists and not have him on the list in a prominent place.
Yeah, for me, my main argument is that when you think of Superman, most likely his Superman is the one in your brain for most of the people in the world. LaMar, who's number 2?
I'm gonna go all the way back to the beginning, because a lot of times when I use these lists, I go back to the beginning and work my way up.
Mhm.
So I'm just going to go Joe Shuster
Okay.
because the reason why is because the first Superman comics I actually read were like reprints of like the old stuff, because you could find them like in collections. Like even when I was growing up in the 80s, like they would have them, but they were like in a hardback form, so they would have these different stories from the different periods of Superman up to then, which then spanned over like a 50-year period. But and those early issues were the ones that I first read. And so was a big reason why I was a fan of Grant Morrison's Action Comics run, because he kind of like took those elements and brought them into the now. That was one of like if I had to like list like Superman runs period, that's one of my favorite ones, really. And I didn't expect to enjoy it as much as I did, but it harkens back to that era. And so yeah, I gotta put him up there, because a lot of the ways, like we were just talking about conveying motion, a lot of that stuff was already in place in those first few issues in some kind of way. Even though he wasn't flying, he was able to do it in a way that shows like he would jump, and it would tell
Yeah.
you that he would jump, right? But you like it would be like 1/8 of a mile or something like that, which is a really precise measurement for somebody jumping, right? But 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 he would play with the motion and stuff. But the way that he would do it, I don't know. I wish that I was a kid in the 30s seeing that for the first time.
Oh
So
man.
when I think about his art, that's the first thing I think about, because you have this really like paradigm shift, like beyond belief. So just for that alone, he's got to be there.
And of course, he doesn't exist without him.
Yeah, that too. Yeah.
Neither does Lois Lane or Lex Luthor. Like,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah, those are big. Those are big ones.
Yeah.
The creation of Lex Luthor and Lois Lane. The argument against Joe Shuster is that they moved away from his model pretty quickly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And
but only because I think his eyesight was going, and so other artists had to take over, and then I think it organically kind of moved away from his model.
Mm-hmm.
But it makes you wonder, if his eyesight hadn't been going, what Superman would have ended up being under him.
Mm-hmm.
Like,
it's very interesting because Joe Shuster had, he was the champion of the oppressed. He was a champion for social justice. That's Superman. And it just changed as time went by, and then Grant Morrison brought it back for Action. And you were talking earlier about motion, LaMar. Joe Shuster knew how to draw motion. It was the thing he was best at.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So. Absolutely. It's weird, actually, because while I was preparing for this, I was reading some of these like top 10 best Superman artist lists you find on the internet. And one of them like was talking about Joe Shuster and saying like, oh, he wasn't a very dynamic artist. And it's like, what? Are we like reading the same comic? I mean, all right, you could say those early ones were so crude, but
they're crude,
Superman never. Yeah, they're crude, but Superman never stops moving in them. Like, he's always dashing. There's that real sense of energy. Like, he's dashing here and there from one thing to the next. Like, he never stops moving under Joe Shuster. It's absolutely bizarre that they would say that he's not dynamic.
And come on, there's a reason that cover flew off the shelves. It's because it looks so cool.
Absolutely, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, Paul, who's number 3?
So I'm not going to stray too far from the time period we're at the moment. I'm going to go for Wayne Boring.
Oh, Wayne Boring.
Yeah.
I'm surprised.
Because, he
There's another Silver Age artist I thought would go before Wayne Boring, but okay.
Well, I do have him on my list too.
Okay,
but Wayne Boring, he was one of the people who came after Joe Shuster then, and he became so good, so associated with the character that he started then doing the strips under his own name, and he kind of did Superman as that sort of barrel-chested, Flash Gordon, heroic kind of character that was super influential then to everything that came afterwards. And in a way, he sort of set the standard for drawing superheroes, in that sort of like, ha-ha kind of way. And, even though like the way he drew Superman was like really masculine, there's something really beautiful about how he draws Superman as well.
Very
Like
graceful.
I thought, graceful, yeah.
Yeah,
I mean,
very
he's
graceful.
really graceful, but also like, I mean, he kind of looks like his Superman kind of looks like Elvis before Elvis was even a thing, kind of thing, you know, with this sort of rounded kind of big jaw and the sort of curl at the front. And there's this one strip in particular that he drew, the origin of Superman, and the sort of splash page to open the strip is like Krypton blowing up, and Superman's like, "Oh God, you know, Krypton's blowing up," and he's crying or whatever. And he's drawn Superman with these big, beautiful blue eyes with sort of really distinct eyelashes on them, and it's absolutely beautiful. And I find it really interesting that someone so associated with such a masculine, heroic kind of Superman could draw such a beautiful Superman as well. And so for that reason, that's why I'm picking Wayne Boring.
At number 3, that's higher than he'd make most lists, actually.
Yeah.
LaMar, any comments on Wayne Boring?
Yeah, I back up what Paulie was saying 100%. Usually, when you think about like Superman artists, Wayne Boring to use a wrestling analogy, he's like a mid-Carter, you know, in the minds of most people, you know. But I see why somebody would put him, you know, at the top because of what Paulie just said. Because even today, that sort of artistic dexterity where you're able to do that, that's not common even today. And you're talking 50, 60 years later, you know? And he really did set a standard for how superheroes look. And we're still kind of following that paradigm. And when you think about his stretch of material, honestly, it was really vast. We think about it because we're so far removed from it chronologically, but he drew a lot of Superman comics, you know? And like that particular image that Paulie just described, like with that opening splash page and all of that, if you just go back and like look at it, I don't know, there's something about it. There's this indescribable quality to it, you know, because there's a lot of things that are being conveyed there. Because like you got to remember when Krypton blew up, Superman was a child. He doesn't remember that stuff. All of it comes from the stuff that was put in his head by the, you know, the ship and all of that, and looking back on the chronological records of Krypton. But you know, he doesn't remember that stuff. So him actually looking at it as an adult, you know, when he's starting to cry, because, you know, of course that's a piece of himself that conventionally speaking he wouldn't get back, you know, but we know this is comics, right? So we kind of undo and redo things all the time. But it was a really powerful image, and I can remember the first time I saw it, as a child, I was actually reading it in one of the collections I was talking about, one of the reprint collections. And it's a very visceral image, even now, like it's a visceral image, because I actually looked at it not too long ago. But Wayne Boring was a great artist. Now the quality of the writing while he was on the book, you know, we could, you know what I mean? But yeah, the art was always top notch. Yeah.
Yeah, I will say that in these DC history books, there is a Silver Age Superman artist that gets mentioned a lot that is not Wayne Boring. But Wayne Boring is almost always mentioned. So he's never forgotten.
Yeah.
He is so he goes number 3 on our list, but he's one of the top 2 artists of the Silver Age for Superman. By consensus, there's 2 important Silver Age artists for Superman, and one of them is Wayne Boring. I'm going number 4, and I can't believe I'm the one who's going to pick this guy, but when I think of my favorite, most consistent era of Superman, I think of the late 80s to the mid to late 90s. The problem with picking that particular time period is finding one person to kind of give the credit to, because they were all so good. But if I have to be honest, the person who set all that in motion is John Byrne. So number 4 is John Byrne, going back to 1986. Man of Steel, and then around 30 issues of Superman, or 38 months worth of issues of Superman in Action Comics. Rebooted Superman for the post-crisis crowd. I am not a Paul knows this. I'm not a big fan of
Mhm.
his writing for Superman, but I was a very big fan of his artwork. And even in his writing, it did set the groundwork for what a lot of the the writers after him had to work with. So number 4 is John Byrne. Comments?
I would definitely agree with him being very high on this list. Again, he's like a really graceful Superman artist. I think that's something that's been present in everything. Every artist we've picked so far have been the most fluid and graceful ones. And again, the way he draws Superman, when he draws Superman flying, you can see the joy that Superman's getting out of flying. You know, he draws Superman doing these amazing loop-the-loops. And he's smiling as he does it, and you really get the sense that Superman's loving flying. And something else that Byrne brought to the character, which kind of summed up his approach in the writing as well. He's famous for making Superman more vulnerable, a bit less planet destroying or planet pulling, and a bit more sort of being able to get beat up and bruised a bit. And he was the first artist, I believe, to start consistently drawing Superman's cape getting torn. And that's something that's still around today. And I think Byrne's logic was that in the way that John Byrne over-explains certain things, I think he said that Superman had this aura that extended about an inch away from his skin, and everything within that aura was invulnerable. And that's why his costume is invulnerable, but his cape isn't. And from a writing perspective, I don't think we need to go into that much detail, but visually, you know, the idea of Superman getting into battle, and when it's really getting like this is a tough battle, his cape is all burnt and torn and flying behind him. That's a really powerful image, and he's kind of responsible for that. And people are still like, you pick up a comic tomorrow that's fresh out this week, and you'll probably see Superman having a torn cape in it. You know, that happens to this day.
2 other things to his credit. He really revolutionized the treatment of Lois Lane.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
also businessman Lex Luthor.
Mm-hmm.
So that's John Byrne.
Nobody got what he drew Lex Luthor. Like, he drew Lex Luthor as this sort of big, powerful man who'd started to lose it because he was getting older. You know, this man who'd been like this colossal man in his youth, and now he's approaching middle age, and he's getting paunchy, and there's a bit of a chin there. I can identify with that, you know. But so he didn't draw his Lex Luthor. Yeah, he was a fat guy, but he wasn't like a blob. You know, he was like he was a middle-aged guy, a powerful guy who's, you know, the processes of age were starting to affect him, and it's all the more reason for him to resent Superman, this man who will stay perfect forever, and him, Lex Luthor, I have to succumb to the rigors of age, you know, while he gets to stay perfect. It's not fair. And just that visual thing just sums up so much about Luthor's character. And I think subsequent artists just didn't get that. I suppose this is a bit cheeky for me to say this, because some great artists came after Byrne. But like, for example, Jerry Ordway, when he drew Lex Luthor alongside John Byrne, he would just draw a fat man.
Mm-hmm.
And he wasn't just a fat man. There was more going on there. And I think even Dan Jurgens, he was a bit better. But even so, he didn't just get Lex Luthor just right like Byrne did. So yeah, you're absolutely right there with Lex Luthor.
That's so that's John Byrne at number 4. LaMar, any comments before we move on to you for number 5?
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Like, John Byrne was the artist on Superman when I actually started going into comic book shops, because where I'm from southeastern North Carolina. So when I was a little boy, the only place that we had to go get comics would be like on the newsstand or like in a grocery store or something. So that was our entryway into comics and things. But what, you know, in addition to what Paulie was saying about how John Byrne drew Superman, like, he enjoyed using his powers, right? And that was sort of a new dynamic, because you would see bits of it here and there, but in the way that he did the figure drawings and stuff like that. Like when he was like, you know, you have the trademark Superman thing where he's standing there like this and people are shooting him at his chest and the things are bouncing off and stuff. Even with that, like he would draw him sometimes with like a little smirk, you know? And so it was clear that he enjoyed using his powers. He enjoyed being a superhero. And, you know, I kind of, you know, I wish that that essence of him would be portrayed more often because everything is just so kind of bogged down, you know, when it comes to the tone of things. And they're a little more grounded. And I just would kind of like to see Superman doing that again, or, you know, superheroes in general doing that again. And a lot of the language, like, again, what Paulie just said, a lot of the language that he created for how Superman moved with his figures and stuff, a lot of that was lost because after that era, he started to be like bulked up again, you know. And so a lot of that finesse was lost. But I do think that, you know, we could talk once again, we could talk about the writing all day, but I think visually what he brought to Superman and those elements, even though they were kind of like overthought a lot of the times, like I don't need to know that, oh, Superman flies because of he has an innate telekinesis and it pushes him away from objects. So he's able to kind of like nobody cares, dude. He can fly, right? He flies because he's Superman. That's what Superman does. That's really all we need to deal with, right? We don't need the rest of the stuff, even though some of it's cool just to kind of hear somebody say it. And then I'm just like, okay, if that's what you say it is, okay, but he flies, right? So, you know, but yeah, John Byrne, he had a knack visually of dealing with these characters when he would go to other characters, even when he did the Spider-Man run that almost nobody likes, right? Because of the changes and stuff, you know. But you know, he would do interesting things with the characters. So it's I'm glad even if it didn't work out. I like seeing people put the effort into understanding the characters visually, and he's always been a master at that. If you go back and look at the X-Men comics he did, you know, all of the characters move differently. Like Wolverine didn't move the same way Colossus moved, you know.
Mhm.
And so he was a guy who always put consideration into the way the powers worked and even their personalities and things, you know. And so it just as a Superman fan, I appreciated that.
And number 5 is you.
Okay. Number 5, who am I gonna go? Because Paulie actually he took my pick with Wayne Bohr, and I'm not mad though. So I'm just trying to think off the top of my head. I think, and I'm not going to name the other artists. I'm going to let somebody else do that, just to kind of spice it up a little bit. I'm going to go Kurt Schaffenberger.
Kurt Schaffenberger. Okay.
Yeah,
I actually did not have him on my list. I forgot all about him. Go on.
that's why I put him there. That's why I did it. Yeah, you know, and the reason why is because there's like maybe 2 or 3 artists during that period of Superman, and they all kind of communicated in a general sense, in a similar manner, but then they each had their individual things that they kind of did a little different, you know. So like what Paulie was talking about earlier about the barrel chest, you know, we're coming out of that like that Tarzan era and stuff like that. And so when you would see these depictions of heroes on television and like in movies, that's how they looked, you know. But when you transition it to the comic book, when you transition it to the comic medium, there's more that you're able to do because you're putting images on a page. So you can do things you couldn't do like in a live action movie of the time. And Kurt Schaffenberger, he actually did a very good job of maintaining that. And so, because there was a shift that was happening, like, of course, when you're in it, you don't necessarily know what's happening, but there was a shift that was happening in the art styles and the motifs and things as you're coming into, you could say, like, as you're coming into like the 60s and things like that, and things were starting to shift a little bit. But all of those guys were kind of there, still holding down that particular like barrel chest motif, and a lot of the poses and things that come from that. You still see them sometimes, depending on who the artist is. So the language hasn't gone away. So I think that he should be mentioned, if for nothing else. There was a certain torch that he kept going that permeated throughout comics of all types. So I think just for that alone, you know, and the fact that he's working on Superman, I think is worth a mention just for that alone.
Well argued. I can't really argue against that. Other than there's another Silver Age artist.
What I will say about Schaffenberger, though, is that he, you know, sometimes when you're reading these Silver Age Superman comics, you're kind of like, oh, is that Dick Sprang? Yeah, I think so. Is that's Wayne Bourdain? Yeah, is that this other guy that we're going to talk about? But like Kurt Schaffenberger, you know straight away it's him. You know, it's even amongst that sort of house style that they all had, it's very distinctive that it's him, the way he draws people and the way he draws faces.
And Paul, number 6.
It's going to be that guy that we've all been talking about. Kurt Swann. Definitely. Because it's amazing, really, how long he drew Superman for. Like, it spanned like 3 or 4 decades, I think. You know, it was 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s too. And he's like the quintessential Superman artist. You know, before the 80s, his was the Superman you pictured. And it's a very distinctive Superman, and it kind of set the tone for everybody else. And it really sort of came into its own then as we got into the 60s and 70s. It's almost like a sort of dad-like Superman, which I think is something a lot of people go to the character for. It's something, if I'm honest, I kind of go to the character for this sort of paternal older brother aspect. And Kurt Swann kind of sums that up in the way he draws Superman. It's a very sort of warm, and he's very distinctive. You can tell his Superman is different from his Bruce Wayne and his Barry Allen and from everybody else. He's got proper, recognizable facial features that are his very own. And it's really the way he draws faces that really kind of draws me to Kurt Swann, because you look at his sort of backgrounds and his layouts and stuff, and they're sort of, and I don't mean this in a sort of unkind way, but they're very functional. They're kind of doing their job, you know, the sort of cityscape behind whatever the characters are doing, the backgrounds on his covers. It's just like a shop window, a building, you know, it's all very functional. But the sort of faces are where Kurt Swann's characters and drawings come alive. And whenever you find a list of Superman artists on the internet and they talk about Kurt Swann, they'll always show the sort of the style guide that Kurt Swann did with all Superman's different facial expressions, just to show how unique each facial expression was on Superman, the way Kurt Swann drew it. But there's one story in particular that kind of, one of the stories that got me into Superman as a kid that Kurt Swann drew. And that sort of way of doing all these different emotions on Superman's face kind of came into the story. And it's not a very famous story. It's Action Comics number, I've got it written down, Action Comics number 405. And it's a really weird story where someone's trying to kill the president. So Superman locks him in this super vault that he's invented with him. And then gradually Superman starts going mad as he realizes that the person who's trying to kill the president is actually himself. And as he's realizing this, that he has this weird sort of split personality situation going on, he starts going crazy. But he's locked in the vault with the president as Superman's going crazy. So it's quite a tense story. And this, you've got this unseen foe going through all the traps in the vault that Superman's devised. And as the unseen foe gets closer and closer, Superman's brain starts breaking. And it's all sort of there on his face. In fact, there's this one sort of panel, half-page panel, where Swann has drawn like Superman gradually getting crazier. And it's like sort of 5 seconds away, Superman's a bit anxious. 4 seconds away, he's starting to get scared. 2 seconds away, he's terrified. And you can see this sort of gamut of emotions that Kurt Swann's capable of in story form. And so for me, that really obscure story is one of the biggest sort of highlights of Kurt Swann's strength. And so I rambled on a bit, but that's why I love Kurt Swann.
Kurt Swann started drawing Superman in 1948. And he stopped drawing Superman in 1996.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, yeah, around nearly 50 years. I'll be honest, out of the 3 Silver Age artists we've named, he's actually my least favorite. Just because I feel like Kurt Swann is a very good artist, but I feel like there's a clinical precision to his work.
Yeah.
That so we were talking about people who could draw motion and movement, and I feel like he was holding that back. Which not to say that he couldn't draw it, but I felt like he was kind of holding it back for the sake of technical precision. If that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely.
LaMar, any thoughts on Kurt Swann before we move on to number 7?
Yeah, I was gonna bring up what you just brought up about how, some people find his style a little too, like, they kind of feel like there's not enough energy there.
Mm-hmm.
And I can see why somebody would say it. And in a lot of cases, there's some comics you can read where you'll see that, but one thing I will say though is that Kurt Swann, he may have been one of the first artists to actually where you have that less exaggerated style, and then we have this move towards like more realistic stuff.
Yeah.
He's probably one of the first guys who actually did that. And so because we have the attestation of his style over, like you said, a 50-year period like that, you can actually see the evolution happening around him, with other people coming in and actually starting to do it. Because like you said, you get the Superman movie, and that kind of changes everything. And it starts to be incorporated into the comics and stuff like that particular style and the way Superman looked. So when you look at a lot of his work within that period, like in the 60s and the 70s and stuff like that, he's kind of like telling you that something else is coming, because we're talking about, because when we're talking about Superman, naturally we're going to talk about the chronology of a character who's been around for close to 100 years at this point. So it's just natural to talk about the timeline and the evolution of the styles and things like that. But it's hard to say that he wasn't extremely consistent though. And I think he pretty much beats everybody, I think, as far as consistency and stuff. And even as he got older, because like you said, he stopped drawing him in 1996 because he kind of didn't really have much of a choice, right?
Yeah.
So
He died. So
yeah, he died in 1996. Yeah. You know what I mean? So, and to that degree, I guess maybe his health was good over that certain amount of time. So his art was really consistent, so even like in his later years, his art was still really good,
Mm-hmm.
and which is to speak to what you were talking about the clinical and technical nature of his art. It's even harder to do that because you can't fall back on, stylistic stuff, because sometimes people who do that, they'll use like the exaggerated stuff to kind of hide the fact that the artwork isn't, their line work and things like that isn't as good, the technical stuff. But when you get older, you can't necessarily rely on that. But if you actually know how to draw things well, when you get older, even if your health fades, you can still do it,
Yeah, it's weird how Kurt Swann is such an iconic Superman artist, because in a lot of ways he's kind of like the bizarro version of Joe Shuster.
He is, yeah, exactly.
He's the complete opposite of Joe Shuster in style. There's not a lot of dynamism in his work, but they're a lot less crude as well. They're like you say, really detailed and precise.
Exactly. I was going to say, we're talking about Joe Shuster was crude but had a lot of motion. And here I am now saying Kurt Swann is the exact opposite. So nice mentioning Bizarro there. Good reference. I'm going to name a Silver Age artist for number 7, which is, I actually didn't expect to name him until I was preparing for this, but Al Plestino.
Yeah.
Al
Okay.
Plestino, I don't know if his art style is one we'd recognize as being one that actually defined Superman, but I don't think you can run away from this. Co-created Supergirl, co-created Cosmic Boy, Lightning Lad, and Saturn Girl, co-created Brainiac in the Bottled City of Kandor, and also drew the first comic book story that featured Kryptonite, and also was responsible for drawing that one Superman story that co-starred JFK that was produced before JFK was assassinated and released after JFK was assassinated. So he has a legendary story under his belt too. So Al Plestino for me, number 7. Even though honestly, if you asked me to pick his Superman out of a hat, or out of a lineup, I don't think I'd be able to tell you.
That's interesting, because that's kind of what I was saying about Kurt Schaffenberg, that you couldn't tell an Al Plastino, but you could tell a Kurt Schaffenberg, couldn't you?
Mm-hmm.
But I think Plastino actually drew one of my all-time favorite Superman stories as well, Superman Under the Red Sun from Action Comics number 300. I absolutely love that story. And he drew that, and he drew these sort of weird creatures that Superman comes across in the wasteland of future Earth, like the giant land whales and these sort of weird bouncy creatures that you can ride on. And so he's got that going for him. He's probably drawn some of my favorite stories of all time.
LaMar, any comments? And then it's your turn for number 8.
Okay. You can't really get away from his influence when it comes to Superman. I mean, even when you step outside of the Superman books, like you said, we have the 3 Legion, the superheroes members. You have the Kandor, and all of that, like the Brainiac and all of that stuff. Like you can't get away from his influence, and we still see a lot. Like that stuff is still going strong today. So the ideas were strong, and comics are a visual medium. So if the idea is not executed properly, we see over time the ideas go away. Now, sometimes people will bring them back and give them new life, but those ideas have been, constant since they were created. So for a person who brings something to life like that, it's you like, and to have his hands in so many different things that are integral to Superman, like you can't separate Superman from any of those things. We know that because people have tried to do it and it doesn't work, right? So you got to give
the
it up
Legion
to him
doesn't really work without Superman. What?
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to digress a little bit, and I'm going to say something like this. Kate Hudson was nominated for an Academy Award for her performance for Almost Famous. And that was the only time Kate Hudson was ever nominated for an Academy Award. I don't think she's ever really been praised in much else or anything. So what that says to me is that put in the right circumstances, you're going to make an impact. Al Plastino worked with Otto Binder with everything I just mentioned. Worked with Otto Binder, arguably the greatest comic book superhero writer of the golden age.
Yeah.
And a lot of those ideas were already with Otto Binder coming because he was transplanting them from Shazam, from Captain Marvel.
Yeah.
But because Al Plastino was the one who executed it in DC, he earns a spot on this list. It's arguable that anybody who was working with Otto Binder at the time makes the list, right? Like whoever ended up working with Otto Binder might be the one I mentioned for number 7. It didn't have to be Al Plastino.
Yeah.
So that's circumstances matter is what I'm saying.
Oh yeah, they definitely do. Yeah. Right place at the right time.
Number 8, LaMar.
Okay. Kind of for the same reasons that we were just talking about Plastino, and also for some of the same reasons that we were talking about Lopez, I'm gonna go with Neil Adams.
I was wondering when somebody would name him.
Yeah, I'm gonna go with Neil Adams. Like he doesn't have a sustained run on any particular Superman book, but but when we go back and look at like the other stuff he did, like when he was doing covers and art and stuff for like the Justice League comics, like in the 70s and stuff like that, Um, like some of the images for Superman that he created, like on covers and even on promo art and things like that, because he comes from a commercial art background. Like that's kind of like his wheelhouse. So his covers from that period are just amazing. Like you could pick like any random 10 Neil Adams Superman images, and these are things that we still see people parroting off today, and the images are just kind of like everlasting. Like for example, the one
The
with
chains.
the chains and him busting out
Chains.
of the chains. That's been done so many times. That's a part of Superman's mythology now.
And he's
you
not
know
the first one. He's not the first one to draw Superman breaking out of chains, but he's the
no,
guy who defined it.
he defined it. That's my
Yeah.
point. Exactly. And there's lots of moments, and he has these moments like over and over and over again with other characters. There's X-Men stuff that he's done that when you think about the characters, you have that, for example. But I think just from a visual standpoint, you'd have to include him because he was kind of like that bridge between like the 50s and the 60s stuff,
Yeah.
and then like the 80s stuff. So like we wouldn't have like the Byrne stuff and all of that without the Neil Adams stuff.
That's true of the X-Men too. Very literally.
Very much so.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean you can't ever really go wrong with Neil Adams. If this were for example a Batman list, he'd be much higher on this list.
Yeah.
Obviously.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And if this were a Green Lantern list, he might be on top.
Yeah.
So
Yep.
Paul, any comment on Neil Adams? And then your turn for number 9.
Well, Neil Adams is the other thing he brought to Superman is that he drew one of the biggest Superman stories of all time in terms of reach and appeal. Is Superman versus Muhammad Ali.
Oh my God! Yeah, that's true. I forgot about that.
Yeah, so he drew that, and it's absolutely gorgeous. It's so much better than it has any right to be. Really, it's an amazing looking comic. And yeah, he drew that. So even if he hadn't done all those amazing covers, just drawing that qualifies him being on this list, I think.
That is absolutely true. That is big enough to get him on the list, like on its own.
Yeah.
I didn't even think about that one. Okay, Paul, number 9. I think I know who you're gonna name. You may as well name him.
Okay, this is actually tough because there's so many others that I wanted to put, but yeah, it's going to be Dan Jurgens, definitely. Is that who you thought it would be?
Yeah, it's exactly who I thought you were going to name.
Yeah, so he's basically the 90s artist, and that's quite a feat because so many people drew Superman in the 90s, and there are so many good artists drew Superman in the 90s as well. But this guy, Dan Jurgens, just stands out above them all. And I mean, for a start, he's the one he was one of the big writer artists behind Death of Superman, and he created Doomsday. So for that, he's made a huge contribution straight away. But also, like when you think of 90s Superman, you're thinking of his drawing. But like, the amazing thing about him is that even though he embodies the decade, he doesn't embody the flaws of that decade. It's not like someone like Liefeld where the anatomy is bad and there's nothing going on in the background. His characters are really detailed, and surely he draws like muscular Superman, and he draws Superman with a sword and a gun in some comics, but also he draws these beautiful faces that are distinctive from each other. He draws these really fluid, graceful depictions of Superman, these really beautiful human drawings of Lois Lane. And he makes Metropolis and the Daily Planet bullpen like a real place as well. So for embodying the decade, but also being more than the decade, I'm going for Dan Jurgens.
Dan Jurgens is also the guy who brought back Married Superman and Lois Lane, but as a writer. We'll get to that in the next episode, everyone. One thing I will say about Dan Jurgens is I mentioned this in our Reign of the Superman one. He is not my favorite of that lineup of Superman artists. That would be a guy I'm going to mention later in the honorable mentions. But when I think of Superman from that era, the model that comes to mind is Dan Jurgens. So that is a big point for Dan Jurgens. LaMar, any comments on Dan Jurgens?
Dan Jurgens, I think when people start to talk about, like, especially what Paulie was saying about, you know, when you think of the 90s in the best way possible, you think of Dan Jurgens. And I think that's a very accurate assessment of what he actually meant to comics, especially from that particular point. And he was involved in so much that was happening with Superman at that time. You can't really separate, you can't separate 90s Superman from Dan Jurgens. And to speak to what you were saying earlier about how that's the era that's the most consistent as far as like Superman stories and the quality of them. He's a huge part of that process, you know, and so much so that I don't think that level of consistency would have been possible had he not been on that job, you know. And I think he's a really good storyteller, and the way that he lays out his panels and things like that.
Underrated. He's underrated.
He's very underrated, like as a draftsman and as, you know, laying out his books and stuff. And he also is one of the artists I think about when you think about like Metropolis. Like when he does Metropolis, it's like Metropolis is a character by itself, you know? And there's not many people who really do that. Like Metropolis seems like it's alive when he's drawing it, you know? And, you know, that's really hard to do. You know, it's probably easier to do with something like Gotham City because you can play with like shadows and things like that. And there's all sorts of other things you can do. But with Metropolis, everything is supposed to be like pristine and clean and things like that.
And futuristic, which would make it harder because with something like Gotham City, okay, so something like Marvel New York, you'd have references. It would be New York City. With Gotham City, you would have references too. You'd take like, you know, like old timey New York City and old timey Chicago. But Metropolis is supposed to look futuristic, so you got to work with your brain on that one, right? You gotta just imagine that. Yeah,
you have to, and it also works as a perfect. It works as a balance because, you know, ultimately Superman, even though he's called the Man of Tomorrow and stuff, he's a country boy from Kansas, right? So this world should be like something like Metropolis in a lot of ways. When you look at it like that, from a metaphorical standpoint, is probably the closest thing he has to what Krypton was, you know, because it's advanced, it's scientific, you know, and things like that. But he's at home in Metropolis in a way that he probably wouldn't be in Krypton because of his upbringing in Kansas, you know. So it's really interesting kind of to think about it that way. And and Dan Jurgens and the way that he draws Metropolis is, I just like going back and looking at those comics, you know, because some comics I just go back and I look at and I don't even really read them. I just look at the images and stuff. And those Jurgens Superman comics are like something that I just go back to them often and look at them because they're a joy to look at.
Some old comics are just so committed to memory that you don't even need to read the words.
Yeah.
You know what happens.
Yeah.
You know what happens. Yep.
One of my favorite things that Dan Jurgens does is, I think he kind of still does it today, it's a really 90s design quirk that he didn't invent, but he's kind of uses it a lot. I don't know if you ever noticed this, but Dan Jurgens really likes drawing characters with that sort of Gambit style balaclava mask. Because obviously he created Booster Gold, and I think one of his Linear Men characters had it. And then in Superman Doomsday Hunt of Prey, he draws Superman, one of those. And then I think he designed Electric Superman with one. So, I mean, I just wanted to point it out.
Gotta point that out. Electric Superman was Dan Jurgens. Like anything that was big in the 90s, a big Superman thing, most likely Dan Jurgens was the one behind it. Gotta close this off, and we're in agreement on this one. This guy didn't draw Superman comics, but defined the look of Superman for millions of people, Max Fleischer. Those cartoons that aired before movies in the 40s, kind of like how Pixar has short films before movies. Using rotoscope animation, Max Fleischer kind of took what Joe Shuster was doing and kind of put it on the screen Also with the colors and everything. You can't list influential Superman artists without naming Max Fleischer, is what I'm saying.
Wasn't he the first one to have him fly as well?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Apparently, jumping was too hard to animate.
Amazing.
So
Yeah.
Max Fleischer is the reason Superman flies, because they couldn't figure out the physics of the jumping.
Mm-hmm.
So I love
I'm kind of angry at Max Fleischer in a way for inventing Superman flying, just for the reason that in the Golden Age comic strips, because Superman just jumped and he couldn't hover or anything, whenever he was spying on people outside windows, they'd draw him dangling off a ledge or something. Listening in, just dangling. And I kind of miss dangling Superman.
Yeah, like if you go back and look at a lot of the Superman comics before the invention of him flying, man, Superman was just doing a lot of things that you just wouldn't associate with Superman today if you thought about it. Like how running is one, because literally in Action Comics #1, he's literally running from building to building, beating the crap out of people, right? And so like he walks in and there's some politicians having a meeting or something, and he rearranges the room with them, and then he goes and then there's a woman that's being abused by her husband or whatever, and he sends the guy flying and all this other kind of stuff, and then there's some guy who's doing something, and then he picks the guy up by the ankle, specifically by the ankle now. He picks him up by the ankle and throws him across the horizon. And then you can tell that something broke when he landed, even though they don't show it, right? So, but yeah, I see what Paulie's saying, because like once the flying thing comes, it's like a lot of that stuff kind of went away, because it's kind of like there's a sensibility there, like, okay, we can't keep this guy to the ground anymore. So we have to come up with new things for him to do. But it really, in a lot of ways, that actually revolutionized comic book storytelling. I don't think we look at it now. And those cartoons, let me just say this too. Those Max Fleischer cartoons hold up against anything you can put in front of them right now.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
It's crazy. It's absolutely insane. Yeah.
Especially the early ones. Mechanical Monsters and everything. I feel like a little later on they got a little more recycly with their animation in the second half. But like that first half, oh my god, they're beautiful animation.
Yeah. And even the stuff like he did with Popeye.
Oh
like I think it was like the Sinbad the Sailor thing. That's a beautiful cartoon. I still watch that, like and I still give that like to children and show it to children, and children love that stuff, and they're like, oh man, what channel does this come on? It's like, dude, there were no channels when this was made.
It just moves.
Yeah. You know what I mean? Yeah. So you have to bring up Max Fleischer and his work, man, because it's still viable, and it's no less powerful than it was when it was created.
It's the same thing. If we were doing a Batman list, you'd have to name Bruce Timm.
Yeah.
Doesn't matter if the impact wasn't done in comics, you'd have to name Bruce Timm. It's just, you can't not name him. Okay, let's talk about honorable mentions, people who didn't make the list, like really quickly. LaMar, you got people on your list that didn't make it?
Yeah. For me, I tried to think about how I could include Tom Grumman, but just because of the powerhouse people that we have that we mentioned, I couldn't really make it work, and and be honest. And Tom Grumman is another guy when I think about like the '90s Superman.
I really wanted to
one
too.
Of the guys I think about, because he's an amazing artist to me. I love his work.
I wanted to name him. Like, it's just, if you're naming one of the '90s guys, it's got to be Dan Jurgens.
It has to be. Yeah.
And by the time we get to Dan Jurgens, we're already at number 9. So it has to be Dan Jurgens. I really wanted to name Tom Grumman and Kerry Gamble.
Yeah, him too. Yep.
Yeah.
But I couldn't do it. I just couldn't do it. Anyone else, LaMar?
I'm trying to think. Is there anybody else I wanted to name?
I had personally, just because I see this guy on a lot of merchandise, Ed Mckennis.
Yeah, Ed McKennis, yeah.
And we don't have anyone from the 21st century on our list, which is not to say that we hate modern artists, but it's just there's so many, and when you're talking about influential, you gotta go old school. Ed Mckennis is on a lot of merchandise. I don't think we can get away from his Superman either.
Yeah, and back, actually, Ed McGuinness is a good example of what I'm talking about the paradigm shift in the visual stuff, because he started drawing his characters, and they were always like super bulked up. So, yeah, and and he'll tell you that he was inspired by like the action figures in the 80s, like the He-Man figures and stuff. So he wanted his comics to look that way, and so he's one of those people like in the early 2000s, and there was a few artists that made things shift again, and he was one of them, and I didn't like his work at first. There was something about it that wasn't connecting with me, but then he got better as time went along, and I started to understand his work a little more, and I really love his Superman work.
I also had, for obvious reasons, Frank Whiteley.
Yeah.
Drew a landmark Superman story in All-Star Superman. Like that would have, if our list had been thinner, that would have been enough to get him on the list. And Murphy Anderson.
Yeah.
Just drew a lot of classic Superman images, but again, it was also on model that you can't really tell if it's Murphy Anderson.
Yeah.
So that's why he didn't. I didn't name him high. Anyone else? Paul?
I also would have said Frank Whiteley, but he's not been as influential as I wish he had been. Like traits like, having a really relaxed Superman who's comfortable with his power, and a really marked difference between the physicality of Clark Kent and Superman. Stuff like that hasn't caught on with other artists as much as I wish it had. And Gary Frank as well is one of my all-time favorite Superman artists. But everything I like about Gary Frank was present before in other artists.
Agreed.
Like the way, like Gary Frank's like obviously very influenced by Christopher Reeve. It's a realistically proportioned Superman. He doesn't look like a muscle guy. He just looks like a tough, ordinary man. And of course, he's very graceful and fluid and takes joy in his flying and his powers as well. But that's all present in other people we've mentioned who've come before him. So I felt I couldn't really mention him. And I didn't want to mention this guy because he's not my favorite artist. And as a storyteller, I don't rate him. But you can't deny his association with Superman is Jim Lee.
Okay.
Because he's on so much merchandise now, and if you Google Superman and click on images, it's probably a Jim Lee that's going to turn up. Jim Lee image.
Because there's also a limited number of Jim Lee images too, but like it just turns up.
Yeah, exactly. But I also think it feels like there's a limited number of Jim Lee images, but there's probably more than you'd think. But he kind of draws him in the same poses all the time. so it probably feels like there's less Jim Lee images than there actually is. And of course, he designed the new 52 Superman suit, which isn't my favorite Superman suit, but obviously appears on a lot of merchandise too. So it's probably worth mentioning him because of that.
I was going to say Gary Frank. So those proportions, like trying to make him look like Christopher Reeve. Garcia-Lopez did it. John Byrne did it, but Gary Frank did it exactly like Christopher Reeve.
Yeah.
And Gary Frank does have a couple of landmark Superman stories to his name: Superman and the Legion, and Doomsday Clock. Doomsday Clock is a Superman story, people. It's not a Watchmen spinoff. It's not a Watchmen sequel.
It's a Superman story.
I would go as far to say it's a terrible Watchmen sequel. It's a brilliant Superman story, is how I would pitch it. Yeah.
And there's also some really powerful images in that story. Like, you know, if it was just put out like without the story, and that's not my commentary on the actual story itself. I'm just saying if it was like a book with just like images, there's some really powerful images, and there's some really powerful Superman images in that book. You know, and Gary Frank is just an outstanding artist, and he continues to get better, and he's been in the business a long time.
Yeah, he's amazing.
You know, yeah.
He's amazing. If we were to make a favorites list, I would have him near the top of mine.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I feel we should mention Leo Nowak as well, because Leo Nowak is the artist who made Lex Luthor bald by accident. Apparently, because obviously Joe Shuster originally drew Lex Luthor as having ginger hair.
Yeah.
And Leo Nowak was drawing the Superman comic strip for newspapers and accidentally looked at the wrong image when he was looking for a model of Lex Luthor.
He thought it was the Ultra Humanite.
Yeah, either the Ultra Humanite or...
Is that serious? That's a serious story?
Yeah, it was either the Ultra Humanite or there was a henchman in Superman #4 that was bald. And so people assume that he mistook one of these people for Luthor and just drew him as bald by accident, and it kind of stuck and became really iconic. So I think he deserves a mention for that.
John Bogdanove for co-creating Steel.
Yeah.
And again, Tom Grummett for co-creating Superboy.
Mm-hmm.
Let's close this off. Your 3 favorite Superman artists. I'm going to start, and we'll end with Paul. My 3 favorite Superman artists are Garcia-Lopez, Cary Gamble, and Gary Frank. Lamar?
I'm gonna pick Gary Frank because you just said him. I love his work. And I'm gonna pick Neil Adams. And I'm gonna pick Joe Shuster.
Mm-hmm. Paul?
So Gary Frank. Definitely Dan Jurgens. And for the 3rd spot, it's almost Frank Whiteley, but it's going to have to be Wayne Bourdain, I think.
Oh, so close for Frank Whiteley. They draw him similarly with like the barrel chest. Yeah,
absolutely.
All right, that has been the top 10 Superman artists of all time. Please let us know your thoughts. Click like, share, and subscribe, and come back next week for the top 10 Superman writers of all time.